So today's speaker is Kevin Brosnan from the University of Limerick. Kevin's a PhD student working in the areas of statistical solutions for medical diagnostic tools and sports performance. Kevin did his undergraduate at the University of Limerick and had previous experience working for companies in industry, including Accenture and Allied Irish Banks. Kevin is currently a member of the Young Statistician section and is involved in the RSS. And he has an excellent talk today. The reason we're having this talk is because I've seen this before. I was doing a local group event for the RSS in Reading, and this talk was the one that was going on before me, and I was obviously quite interested because it's quite a different thing to see in kind of statistics and sports talks. We don't really have many talks like this. And I recognised the name of the speaker, and I was like, I thought I knew this guy, and I remembered him from the RSS conference that year where he was attending because he won the best talk at the RSC conference. So we've got a very good speaker in mind, and this is a very good talk indeed. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Kevin, who can present his talk on false starts in athletics. Are they truly fair?
So, as Rob just said, the talk is going to be about false starts in athletics, and more so in elite athletics. So competitors like Bolt and Shelly-Ann Fraser-Pryce will play a big part in this presentation. And what we're setting out to do is we're setting out to see if the false start rulings that are currently enforced by the IAAF are actually fair to the athletes competing in events. So, just to give you another small bit of background on myself, Rob has pretty much covered it all. So I'm at the University of Limerick. I did my undergraduate here, went on to do a PhD, which I'm currently in the middle of. I'm funded by the Irish Research Council, and the best ways to contact me are either on Twitter, my hashtag is KevBros93, or at my own website at significantstats.org. Just to introduce who else was involved in this, so Dr. Norma Bargari, she's a statistician, particularly in the area of functional data analysis, and is a co-supervisor on my PhD, has contributed largely to this project. Secondly is Professor Drew Harrison, who is a sports scientist and who has actually trained a lot of Ireland's top athletes, and particularly Thomas Barr, who performed outstandingly well at the 400-metre hurdles in Rio. Professor Drew Harrison and his wife, Hayley, were the two coaches for that athlete. And finally, Dr. Kevin Hayes is the other person who's on the co-supervising team with Norma on my PhD, and he's also a statistician with background in multivariate statistics. So they're the three people who have helped out quite considerably on this project, and without them this wouldn't probably have materialized. So I'm going to give a brief outline of what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to introduce the area of athletics. I'm going to talk in particular about the starting process. What is a false start, or why do they happen? The rules surrounding false starts, and in particular from the years 1998 right up to the present. So the rules that are surrounding false starts have considerably changed over time. And then finally, I'll introduce the concept of a response time. A response time kind of has a couple of meanings, so I'll make it clear what we mean by our response time for the sake of this research. Then I'll introduce what we have done, so what stats have we done, or what have we contributed to this knowledge base. Then I'll introduce a very interesting event that was at Rio 2016, and it's a case of what could have been. So the results may not be what the results should have been. And then finally, I'll briefly discuss what has happened since we published this paper, and also what's still left to do and what we plan to do. So the paper has been published. It's published in the Journal of Sports Sciences, and if you look up the effects of false start disqualification rules, it should be the most recent paper published. It was published in August of 2016, right before Rio began. So, the starting process. So, you'll all probably have seen this on television, that an athlete is there standing beside the blocks, and the starter issues a command, and that command is on your marks. And on your marks means you get into your lane, you make sure you're comfortable, and then as soon as they're all comfortable, the starter issues a command of set. The set position is when we see all the athletes come upright and with pressure on the ground and pressure on the blocks behind them. So they're in the set position and they're waiting for the gun. The gun will then only be fired when the athletes have assumed their final starting position. And that means that all the athletes are settled, they're steady on the blocks, and the race is going to kick off as soon as the gun is fired. Now, the time delay between the set position and the gun firing can be quite arbitrary. If the athletes settle really, really quickly, then the gun may be fired instantaneously with the set position, and that's perfectly fine. Similarly, if the athletes are slow to get themselves positioned, the gun may be fired 5 or 10 seconds after the set position. It really depends on the race. And it can also depend on the starter that's issuing these commands. Some starters have that they always leave 4 seconds or something along that line. So in a perfect world, we never get false starts. Everyone waits to hear the gun, and as soon as they hear the gun, then they go. But unfortunately, we don't live in a perfect world, and I know myself from playing sports, if I can possibly get an advantage over the other team or the system, I'll take that chance. So, what is a false start? Well, a false start is when the IAAF start system basically puts a signal into the starter's ear and tells them there's been a false start. So that's the notification of it. But what is it actually detecting? Well, it's detecting that somebody has moved off the blocks or that their pressure on the blocks has changed considerably within 0.1 of a second after the gun has been fired. So that 100 milliseconds directly after the gun has been fired, that's a no-go zone for athletes. You cannot react within that time period. So, moving on again. So, now I'm going to introduce some of the rules. So, in 1998, and this is an arbitrary number, individual warnings go back longer than that. This is when we have data collated from. So in 1998, the system was an individual warning. So what that meant is that if somebody false started, they got a yellow card, and they were on a warning. But then, on the next run, and on the next firing the gun, if somebody else false started, they also got a yellow card. And only until such point that the same person has false started twice does somebody get eliminated. So this could be a very long process. So you've 8 athletes in the race. They could all be on a warning, and 7 of them could be disqualified. And you're hoping the person that's left is not going to attempt to jump the gun, given that he's running against himself. So that was the individual warning system, and that was grand up until about 2004, and a change came in. And the change was particularly around the time it took to run these races, or the time it could possibly take to run these races. And what they brought in was a group warning system. And by a group warning system, what they were going to do was that as soon as one person false starts, so the same guy, this guy here, if you can see my mouse moving, or the guy closest to 2004, that guy is going to false start. But what that means is that everyone in that race is now on a yellow card or on a warning. Once you're on a warning, you only have one more chance. So as soon as this other guy false starts for his first time, he's disqualified from the race because he is under the system of a group warning. Now, that system worked well for a while, and then in January 2010, it was removed due to gamesmanship of athletes in particular. And particularly that was around possibly weaker athletes false starting intentionally on the first go, and then putting extra pressure on everyone to not false start on the second go. So what they decided to bring in was an automatic disqualification. And what an automatic DQ means is that as soon as you false start once, you're out of the race. So this was brought in 2010, and the first real time it got tested was in the 2011 World Championships in Daegu in South Korea. And on the 28th of August, there was a famous race where Usain Bolt was in the 100-meter final, absolutely tipped to win it, and actually false started and was automatically disqualified from the race. And he actually jumped the gun entirely. The gun hadn't even gone, and he had reacted. So yes, he had false started, but under the old ruling systems, there would have been a second chance. So this new ruling system is quite severe. So the last thing, I guess, of background that I need to introduce is about response times. And response times from, I guess, everyday applications are the time taken for a person or a system to react to a given stimulus or event. So how long does it take you to do the required biological and neurological steps to make you to react to something? So in our particular case, what we're thinking about is it's the time taken for an athlete to react to the starter's pistol. So how long from the time the pistol goes can the athlete possibly respond? So initially, the sound goes off, and that's the starter's pistol firing. It takes somewhere between 3 and 6 milliseconds for the sound to go to the ear of the athlete. Now, in this current starting block system, there's a speaker behind each athlete. So it's no longer actually a gun, noise coming from the gun that's fired. The noise is actually delivered through a speaker system at the back of the starting blocks. So each of the athletes is now exactly the same distance away from that speaker. Then it takes about 10 to 15 milliseconds to go from the ear to the brain. The brain processes that and passes it down to your nervous system, which takes about 50 milliseconds. And then from the nervous system to the muscle activation, or at least the start of muscle activation, that's about 25 milliseconds. And then finally, we also have a detection limit. So it takes us a little bit of time to actually record that difference. And that can be anywhere between 5 and 10 milliseconds. So altogether, our range is somewhere between 93 and 106 milliseconds. Now, this system is talking about an absolutely perfect system. So the 10 to 15 milliseconds ear to brain, that's probably the lowest range it could possibly be. Likewise, the 50 milliseconds, and likewise the 25. The 5 to 10 is pretty constant. Technology is pretty constant across particularly World Championships, European Championships, and Olympics. But this 3 to 6 milliseconds can also be affected. So if you have a strong headwind into the athletes, that 3 to 6 milliseconds, even if it's affected only by 1 or 2 milliseconds, can be considerable. But we can see that this range is somewhere between 93 and 106, and that's the absolute optimal we can reach. So I would question the 100 milliseconds. So what we have is we have a lot of data, as we all usually do as statisticians. And we have from World and European Championships, and we have male and female athletes. So we have 2,310 unique athletes across this data set. We have 1,007 women, 1,303 men, so quite a large range of men and women. And in particular, we have 8,559 response times from athletes at different events. And our events are the World Championships, which is 6,922 of those reaction times, and European Championships, which is considerably smaller, at 1,637. And these all range back from 1998 right up to 2016. So, just to rule out anything about maybe that there's a climate difference in the reaction times of athletes, the European Championships, the outdoor championships have been held in quite varying places. So we've gone from Barcelona right up to Helsinki and then back down to Zurich. So quite a different climate across those three countries. And likewise, the indoor championships have moved around as well. Similarly, the World Championships, we've pretty much been all over at least the Northern Hemisphere for the outdoor championships. So we've been in Canada, we've been in Birmingham in the United Kingdom in 2003. And we've also been in Daegu in South Korea, and that was the 2011 one I mentioned earlier with Usain Bolt false starting. So quite varied locations again. And likewise, the indoor championships at world level, again, quite varied climate. So we're in Moscow, but we're also in Valencia, and we're in Doha as well. So quite varying climate. So with that variation in the data, we're assuming that any sort of climate thing possibly doesn't exist for a false start. So, first thing we did was we looked at the different events that we're modelling, and in particular we have the 100 metres, the 110 metre hurdles, and the 200 metre events from outdoors, and we also have the 60 metre and 60 metre hurdles from indoor championships. These numbers in the circles along the bottom of what's labelled as slide 13 are the number of false starts in those events. So we can see that there's 3 false starts in 100 metres, 5 in 200, and 1 in each of 110 metre hurdles and 60 metre hurdles. You can also see that we've recorded no false starts in any 60 metres since 1998. But what's interesting here is the box plots. They seem to exhibit that on an event basis that we seem to do okay. Yeah, we can get quite close to that 100 milliseconds, but we're doing relatively okay, and there isn't a major difference across events. So we're going to assume that events response times, at least between 60 metres and 200 metres, that the response time is equally as important to each of them, and we're going to include them all in the analysis. The next thing we're going to talk about is the ruling periods. So this is the individual warning, group warning, and automatic DQ that I talked about earlier. And if we're looking at the box plots again, we're looking at these where gender is just all combined together. There's plenty of literature on response times of athletes that states that males and females respond at a different rate. And I'll come back to why that is later. I'm not going to discuss that now. I'll come back to that towards the end of the results section. But we can see that in 1999 to 2003, there was only 1 false start recorded. However, this is slightly different now. This is a DQ because false starts aren't actually recorded. So we can't get the access for how many times a race was run, or at least not easily without going back through video evidence and so forth. But all we get back is how many people were disqualified because of a false start. So there was only 1 person disqualified for a false start in 1999-2003. Remember, this is the case where everyone has 2 chances. In 2004 to 2009 period, none were recorded. But in 2010 to 2014, we had 9 false starts recorded. And again, this comes down to the fact that you get 1 chance, and if you go too early on that chance, then you're out of that race. So that's the ruling periods. So there doesn't seem to be any major difference between the response times. But what we then went and looked at was maybe there's a difference in the sex across ruling periods. And what you can see in this new chart that's labelled slide 14 is that the men's, there is a trend upwards. So you can see that 1999 to 2003 and 2004 to 2009, the lower quartile of that box plot is on or around that 100 milliseconds. However, that 2010 to 2014 region is just about to start to jump up off that. And I guess the question is could athletes ever respond as quickly as they did in 1999 or the 2004 regions? Because they had that second chance, you could afford to take a risk. And maybe you were just getting away with it. You were just getting lucky. But whereas in 2010, you can't take that chance. You can't take the chance of having that extra goal. So you have to be more cautious, but maybe we're going to assume that athletes also still react as quickly as they possibly can. But they're going to do it fairly this time because they're not preempting the gun. Similarly for the women, you can see the same thing, a slight increase. So those box plots moving off that dashed 100 millisecond line across the time period. And you can even see for women, there's even a little bit of a change between 1999 and 2004 regions and a significant jump in the 2010 region. I'll just make the point that Olympic races and World Championship races have been won and lost by the magnitude of 3 or 4 milliseconds. So in most research, I guess you wouldn't consider this to be a significant change, this small little jump off the 100 milliseconds. But when you're talking about athletics, something as small as 3 or 4 milliseconds is actually crucial to a race. So this difference in the box plots is actually considerable. So the only other thing I would make clear, and I'll come back to this again at the end, you can see that we had 10 false starts across all ruling periods since 1998. You can see that 9 of them are being done by men, and only 1 of them is being recorded for women. And I'll come back towards the end and maybe provide some bit of insight as to why that may be. So what we did was we took all our data and we're going to model men and women's response times across all of these events separately. So we're going to follow previous literature and assume that men and women have different response times, at least in the setting of elite athletic start blocks. So what we did was, again, we pulled a model from the literature, in particular from the psychology literature, and what it is the modified exponential Gaussian distribution, or the exponentially modified Gaussian distribution, in fact. And what it contains is you have an exponential component there leading us, followed by the cumulative distribution function of the standard normal. So it's basically just a multiplicative nature of the standard normal with an exponential component. And this is particularly used in games where people are required to push a button and you see how quickly they respond to stimulus, either audio or visual, which is exactly what we're talking about. We're seeing how quickly can athletes put pressure on the starting blocks, given that we give them some stimuli, which in our case is a starter's pistol being fired. So I'm going to introduce my 10 athletes, and generally, most of you probably on this call will know that generally there's 8 athletes in a race. 10 athletes happens to work a little bit better for this example that I'm going to show, so I'm going to pretend that there's 10 athletes, but I have all my athletes lined up, and what I'm kind of going to do is try and line them up in where do they fit in terms of a response time. So very fast is a very short time. Fast takes them a little bit longer. Slow, a little bit longer again. And very slow is that they're the last people to jump off the blocks and get themselves going. So what I'm going to say is that this guy is really, really happy. He's after taking off the quickest of the lot, and he's away out of the box as quick as he can be. Then we get quite a few guys here in the fast category. So they're happy enough. Maybe they have the legs to catch this guy who has responded very fast, but they're particularly happy. And then we get a few less in the slow category, and some of them seem happy enough. The other guy doesn't seem too impressed. And then finally we have Sleepy down here, who's the guy who's reacting last off the blocks. So you can see the kind of distribution we're getting. So it has this Gaussian peak, but this tail is extended quite long towards very slow response times. And that's what we expect. We expect a large proportion of people to respond quickly, but also have quite a large proportion of people who respond at a slower rate. So now I ask the question is, where do Shelly-Ann Fraser-Pryce and Usain Bolt, probably the 2 athletes in their respective disciplines, fit on this scale? And it's unusual. Most people would say, okay, they're either very fast or fast, and they respond the quickest, and therefore they're winning events. Well, it actually turns out that both of them are actually in the slow category, but they're happy to be. They have enough cadence or speed to be able to get back in front of the guy who's responded very fast, or in fact the people who responded fast. That's just an interesting observation. Being very fast in your response time off the blocks doesn't necessarily mean you're going to win yourself events. So we move on to some of the modelling that we've done. So a controversial slide title, I guess. Are men and women the same? So we're now on slide 19 for those that are looking at the slides themselves. But this doesn't tell us the whole pile. This just shows us the men and women chart. If we put them together, men are in blue, women are in red, and we can see that the lines aren't quite perfect. And again, that tiny little gap between the blue and the red curve, that's about that 4 millisecond window. So that 4 milliseconds actually comes up pretty much everywhere in this analysis. But it's about a 4 millisecond difference between men and women taking off. And you can see that it's just, the women's curve is just slightly moved, or slightly shifted in comparison with the men. So, of course, me being a man, that means that men are faster than women. But it actually turns out that it's down to a technology and a biology issue. So the technology is based on purely a force threshold. So how quickly can you produce a force on a set of starting blocks? Biologically, men can produce a force quicker than women. So it's not that men are faster than women, at least not mentally. We're not claiming that. We're just claiming in terms of force thresholds, men can respond quicker than females. So we're going to look again at the rule changes for men and women. So The first period is what's on slide 20, and the rule changes for men in red is the 1999 to 2003 period. Then we have the curve for the 2004 to 2009 period. Again, you can see a slight shift where response times have actually got slightly longer. And why is that changing? If athletes were responding fairly under the 1999 to 2003 period, then why all of a sudden have their response times shifted? Just remember, athletes training and everything in the difference between 1999 and 2009 is considerable. So you're talking much better training in 2009, but yet we're getting our response times which are slightly slower. That's unusual. Likewise, when we move to 2010 and 2014, we see a drastic change in that response time curve. And that's what's of interest to us. Why has that changed considerably? Yes, it's more risky to take a chance. But if you're responding fairly, then you know that you won't get caught. So our belief is that people were gaming the system in previous years to try and jump the gun and get the slight advantage. And I'm not saying that's the wrong thing to do. Everybody tries to gain a slight advantage in most sports. And if you can take that chance, you probably would too. So response times are getting slower as the rule changes. I've just said that. And athletes are less inclined to anticipate the starter's gun. So they're less likely to take that chance. So maybe in this 2010-2014 period, we're actually seeing the true possible reaction times of athletes. So what we've done is we've calculated a revised threshold for men, and that's coming in at about 115 milliseconds. And what that involves is figuring out where the density curve, which is shown here in blue, goes to pretty much an absolute zero, or at least to the value of maybe 8 decimal places. And what we're getting is about 115 milliseconds. So considerably different to our 100 millisecond rule that's currently enforced. And as you look back through the years, there's actually quite a lot of people who fall in that 15 millisecond window between 100 milliseconds after the gun and 115 milliseconds after the gun. Going to do the same analysis for women. We're going to use the same colors and everything. So red is the first time period, black, significant shift, and blue, again, not as significant as we've seen with men, but again, still a significant move. What's of particular interest here is the jump between 1999, 2003 and 2004, 2009. And again, I'll make the point, training, rehabilitation, everything has improved over time, but yet our response times are getting slower. So again, pretty much have the same results here. Response times are getting slower as the rules change, and athletes are again less inclined to anticipate the starter's gun. But this time we've calculated a threshold for the females, and what our threshold for the females is this time is 119 milliseconds. So this is the 4 millisecond difference that I've been harping on about for the last 10 minutes, I guess. So that's an important point. So men and women's rulings are different, and again, I draw you back to the point, this is not because men can respond quicker. This is because the system is purely based on a force threshold, and that force threshold is what's making this difference between men and women. So the other thing that the paper that we've published looks at is, do athletes become more inclined to anticipate the gun during a race for the medals? So if you're in the first round and let's say I'm Usain Bolt, I'll pretend for the next 2 minutes that I'm Usain Bolt, and I'm in the first round. I pretty much know I'm going to get through that first round. There's going to be athletes in that who will not be nowhere near my level of speed, and I know I will qualify. But in the final, I may be up against my counterpart Johan Blake or Walter Dix from the US. And then if I can get a slight advantage, well, maybe it's worth taking it. And we're just trying to figure out, do athletes actually take that risk in events that have medals or are against better athletes? So again, this is first round data only for men and women. We compare them. Again, we see this slight gap between men and women. Women in red, men in blue, see this slight gap. As we move on again, move them back out, and we add in the heavy lines, or the solid lines, we see the finals for men and women. So you can see in the men, the quickest reactors actually don't react any quicker, or at least we don't get anybody reacting quicker than the quickest reactors in the first round. But we do get a much larger peak. So people are shifting downwards and reacting quicker, but as the peak is enlarged. However, in the women, in the red, you can see that there's a significant decrease in response time, or quickening of the response throughout the curve, and you also get that increase in the peak. So that's interesting. And when we put them all together, again, men are still responding quicker than females in the final, but you can actually see that females in finals are responding as quick as the density curve that we get for first round from men. Okay, so they're responding that quick. But again, men respond quicker in finals. So obviously what we're saying here is that women's improvements for finals is much better than men, so women are cheating more often. That must be the conclusion, because all the women seem to get quicker. But what it actually is that men tend to cheat regardless of the race. It doesn't matter if there's a medal up for grabs or if it's only a first round. Men, at least from psychology papers that I've read when completing this research, they tend to take a chance when they can take a chance, regardless of what it is. And there's a lot of study on this around college exams and areas like that as well, where men are more inclined to take that chance, whereas women are I guess, more risk neutral or risk averse possibly. So moving on again, and this is probably the slide a lot of you will find probably most interesting. We're going to look at the Rio 2016 women's 100 meter final. So we have a lineup, okay, and this lineup includes 3 Jamaicans, 2 Americans, 1 person from the Ivory Coast, a Trinidad and Tobago athlete, and 1 athlete from the Netherlands. Okay. Now, all we're interested in is the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th athletes in this race. So forget about the first Jamaican, and the next 4 people is what we're interested in. So that's in the Ivory Coast. We've Talou from the Ivory Coast, followed by Elaine Thompson from Jamaica, followed by Tori Bowie from the US, and then, of course, Jamaica, and probably the world's greatest female athlete, Shelly-Ann Fraser-Pryce, at least at 100 meter athletics. And what happened in the race was the race went off, and Elaine Thompson won gold, Tori Bowie got a silver medal, and Shelly-Ann Fraser-Pryce ended up with the bronze. So 2 for Jamaica and 1 for America. But what's of particular interest here is that along the bottom of this slide, which is slide 23, I've shown the response times recorded for those athletes. And this is coming straight off the system at the Olympics. So we see that the first couple of athletes, 163, 136, 157. Okay, they're plausible. And then for the American who won the silver medal, we see a response time of 112 milliseconds. That's incredibly quick. Incredibly quick. You can see that the closest to her is 20 milliseconds later from the Trinidad and Tobago athlete who doesn't even finish in the top 4. Okay? So what we're questioning here is this 112 millisecond actually a true response time? Or is it a fair response time, more precisely? And under our assumption that women response times should be changed to 119 milliseconds, this value would have seen her being disqualified from the race. Similarly, the men's ruling is 115 milliseconds, and we know a difference exists between men and women, and she's not even getting, she would still be disqualified even under the men's ruling that we have proposed in this paper and in this talk. So what we're saying is maybe the Ivory Coast should have been denied a bronze medal in this setting. So the Ivory Coast athlete finished in 4th, and I know I can't go out and say this. If Tori Bowie gets disqualified from this race becomes an entirely different race. The 2 Jamaicans end up running beside each other. There's an empty lane. Things change. But if we just take the assumption that the race result stands exactly as it is, maybe the race result isn't what should have happened. So that's just one of the interesting ones, and there's 3 or 4 more interesting interesting cases from Rio that I could have shown, but just as this is the women's 100-meter final, it's a nice one to show. So the next slide is actually just to give you a little bit of more confidence that I'm not, I guess, pulling the wool over your eyes about this. But this is a chart of Tori Bowie's response times across all the events she has run since she came on the scene. So she's a particularly new athlete, at least at Olympic, world stages. But you can see that her response times, the blue dots mean that they're round heats and that she's qualified. The bronze dot there in the middle, the third dot in, that's that she won a bronze medal at Beijing in 2015. The blue dots again are the first two rounds in Rio, round 1 and round 2, and then this silver dot, which may not actually be entirely visible on a silver background. That was a bad choice of colour. You can see that that's much less than any of the other ones. So how has she possibly gone from recording almost a 160 millisecond response time 2 days earlier in Rio to recording a response time of 112 milliseconds? I'm not going to say that it's impossible. I'm just saying that from what we have studied and what we have shown, 112 milliseconds seems unreasonable and unrealistic. So I'm just highlighting that point there on that slide. And I guess finally, just to wrap up this and leave you all get back to whatever you have to do today, I'm going to briefly mention what's left to do. So obviously, we'd like to go further with this. We'd like to go maybe to the Olympic Council, maybe to the IAAF Athletics Federation, and maybe just see, is there more analysis we can do? Is there something we've missed? Which is always a possibility. As a statistician, you get your data and you analyze it as best you can, but I guess there's always a possibility that you've missed something or you've misunderstood something. Now, we have Professor Drew Harrison on this project all the time, and he knows these systems, so the chance that we've actually made a mistake is probably quite slim. But we'd like to go to them and see where we can go from here. And then, currently the system is these starting blocks with a speaker on the back. But maybe there's a question that, are these starting blocks actually a good recording of a response time? So there's a lot more analysis to be done here yet, and there's actually a group within the University of Limerick actually working on this, particularly under the leadership of Professor Drew Harrison, and there will be more work coming out of UL on this. But currently we're looking to obviously interact with major bodies in athletics, and also to look and see, are we recording the starting blocks right? Is the response time coming from the starting blocks the best recording we can possibly get? Okay. And then two final slides, which I've just thrown in because I kind of had an idea that I'd be under time. And we're just looking at Usain Bolt's 200 meters response times on this graphic. So this is slide 26 for anyone who's not on the global meet. And you can see he's pretty consistent over time. Okay, even this gold medal performance here in Berlin, round 4, gold medal performance 2009, that's still 126, 127 milliseconds, and that's his lowest he's pretty much ever recorded, which is pretty impressive. And then you can see here round 1 of Daegu, that's under the new system, and he records something like 315 milliseconds. The weakest athletes in the field wouldn't record a response time like that, but yet he still qualifies because of his ability as an athlete. I'll just make you aware, this is the 200 meters. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that Bolt had been disqualified from a 100-meter event. These aren't included here. This is only his 200-meter responses. If you take out his false start in the 100 meters, you pretty much get the same thing. His responses are pretty consistent. But the only thing I will draw your eye to is that there is a slight maybe increase, initially at least, when we move into this new ruling period. So then finally, we'll also talk about another exceptional athlete, Shelly-Ann Fraser-Pryce, happens to be also Jamaican. These are her 100-meter performances, and again, she's a little bit more erratic. There can be up to a difference of about 50 milliseconds in some of her response times, but at the same time, she never comes below 147 or 146 milliseconds. Maybe they don't have to. Maybe that's the reason they don't. But you would imagine that Shelly-Ann Fraser-Pryce and Bolt, if they could respond a lot quicker, which would mean making a new world or Olympic record, they would go for it.
So I think now what we'll do is we'll open it up for questions. There is a question from Omar. Is there an argument that we should just ignore any threshold and let be anticipating the gun be a skill in itself?
Yeah, this is a very interesting one, and I would probably be partially in favour of this, that we forget about the threshold and we allow people to anticipate the gun and we train people to do that. But it's very hard. You still have to have some cutoff. So you still have to record them if they move before the gun. So you're still recording a response time. So if they respond before the gun, clearly they should be disqualified. But there has been a discussion about this, and it's even in some of the review papers published, particularly in the Journal of Sports Sciences, about this area, that maybe anticipating the gun should be a skill, and maybe we should be training our athletes to do that.
The question I was just about to ask is, why were there no Olympics included in this analysis?
So there is two recording companies, or timekeeping companies, I guess, Omega and Seco. And while we would love if they both used very, very similar technology that gave us the same response times, they in fact don't, and they actually end up giving us about a 4 millisecond difference, or a 5 millisecond difference, in their response times. And it's partially to do with the delay from getting from the actual block to the system. So the world and Europeans are actually governed, or have been at least for the vast majority of the time, governed by the same system in Omega, whereas the Olympics are actually governed by Seco. And that variation, we didn't want to include it simply because we didn't want that to be something that would make our results maybe null and void.
Nope, that's interesting. And would you consider using them though in the future? Would that be further work that you'd look to do on the Olympic stuff as well?
Yeah, so we are currently looking at that. And one of the issues at the moment is that up until very recently, both the Olympics and the IAAF made all of their response times publicly available with the race result.
Yep.
And that has actually changed recently, and we no longer get the actual response times being recorded in a very simple way that I can go and collate it from a website.
Yeah.
It requires a little bit more work, but we are working towards maybe looking at the Olympics and maybe accounting in the model for that difference in recording system.
Excellent. We've got another question on the chat. Could there be other factors affecting response times, such as adrenaline? For example, in Tori Bowie's case, could it be the fact that it was a final and there was more pressure on the run, and that had an impact on her response?
Absolutely. We're not saying that this is definite. There's definitely other factors that you could include here. The problem with adrenaline is how do you possibly record it?
Yeah.
So, like, one of the things that has been suggested a few years ago was that to even record the response times, that you put a helmet basically on the athletes, and it would record EMG responses in their brain.
Yeah.
And yes, that's the first response. But I don't want to be the person that goes to Bolt and tells them to put a helmet on.
Me neither.
And I would fully agree, Kelly, that there is so many other factors. There's adrenaline. There's the crowd. There could be a photographer who clicks his camera and who happens to make you think that gun is gone. And you preempt the gun, you go, but you actually get away with it maybe.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of factors that could come into that. What we're saying is, let's assume that we've so much data that those small factors don't come into it. In the case that I showed you of Tori Bowie, it's very likely that it was adrenaline. She's a young athlete. It was only her second major event.
Is there a better system, and is there other work in this area that's being done?
So I actually didn't say it at the start, but I guess the work in this area actually started in about 1990, and that's where this 100 milliseconds limit came from. And basically what happened was they got 8 Finnish athletes. They weren't elite athletes because at the time the study was done, there was a World Championships on, and Finland had all their best athletes sent to the World Championships. So they actually came up with this limit on the basis of non-elite athletes originally. And there's been quite a few papers. There was quite a few papers between 1990 and 2000, and then there was a bit of a lull. People kind of seem to think, okay, it's working, our systems are working. But since they've brought in the automatic disqualification in 2011, there has been a surge in the number of papers published on this again. So even the paper we published, there's probably 5 or 6 references to papers from 2010 on, which are just looking at different events. So one of them looks at the Beijing Olympics, for example, and says that there is a difference between males and females and that. In terms of the technology and are people actually working on it, to the best of our knowledge, no. The technology doesn't seem to be what people think is the problem. They seem to be focusing more on the limits and that kind of stuff. And I can't say a whole pile more with regard to that.
Nope, completely understandable. Where do you go from here?
Where do we go from here? Well, we actually have quite a large group working on this here in Limerick. So I introduced Professor Drew Harrison. He has about 15 postdocs and PhD students working under this. Myself, Norma, and Kevin, who I introduced, are also working on this in conjunction with Drew. And I guess, without saying anything, we're trying to move to a system that is extremely fair and that false starts, when they're recorded, are true false starts. But we also don't want starts getting through that are false starts and allowing them to run the race. So there is a lot more work. There probably isn't a whole pile more of statistical work, as in the background bar, looking at the Olympic Games data, and maybe we will end up doing work on that. We'll have to, but now it's kind of over to the sports scientists to see what can they do to improve it, and maybe down the line we'll be publishing a couple of more papers on this as well.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you very much, everybody.